Okay, so this unit we're going to be looking at Chapter 10 and 11, and Chapter 10 is looking at electing leaders. So we're basically going to be focusing on the president and the vice president in this case. So, start off, we need to look at our political system here in the U.S., and the first is that we are a two-party system. And that means we have two political parties. So what's a political party? Well, a political party is an organization made up of citizens who have similar ideas based on public issues, and they work together to put these issues into action, or these ideas into action. So they're looking at trying to change our government or change the way that our government works. Now, parties are completely voluntary. You do not have to belong to one. You can decide to join or not. And usually people who do join a party, they join because they agree with most of the issues. But you can always change your mind. You can say, oh, I don't like this party. I want to go to a different party. So that's a huge possibility. Now, the role of politics or political parties in our political system is that it is a way for a large number of people to come together to get things done if they have similar ideas on how these things should be done. And so typically our political parties are concerned with practical issues on how to get these things done in our government. So what they try to do is they try to nominate, and to nominate means that you're selecting or you're choosing somebody. And so they try to nominate candidates, and candidates are people who run for office. And that's one of the things that they do. They also try to get laws passed, and they try to get programs passed that fall in line with their ideas of what the government or our government or our laws should do. And then another thing that they do is they watch the opposing parties, because they want to make sure that, you know, if they're messing up, they want people to know that so that they can join their party. So they watch those other parties as well. So how did we get to have this two-party system? Well, the beginning of the two-party system began during the presidency of President Washington, our very first president. Before Washington became president, we didn't have political parties. Those developed during his presidency because there were groups of people with different ideas of the direction our country should go. Now, President Washington didn't have a political party. In fact, he really hated political parties. He felt there was really no place for them, that they just kind of messed things up. And so he wasn't really a part of it. Sort of. Anyway, he wasn't really a major part of it, I'll say that. But we see the beginning of the two-party system, and very early on in our history, we had two types of parties. We had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists, remember, they favored the Constitution. They favored a strong central or national government. And eventually, the Federalists are going to develop into the modern-day Republicans. And the Federalists were initially led by Alexander Hamilton. On the other hand, you had the Anti-Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists favored limiting government's power, that it gave the states more power. And eventually, the Anti-Federalists are going to develop into the modern-day Democrats, and it takes a long while to get to the Republicans and the Democrats, and they both go by it in different ways. But that's basically where they lead to. And the Anti-Federalists were initially led by Thomas Jefferson. So, like I said, it takes a long process for them to finally develop into the Democrats and Republicans of today. But basically, what are the Democrats and the Republicans? Well, the Democrats basically thought that government was acting to benefit the wealthy. And so they wanted government to represent the working class, the middle class, the people who have to have jobs in order to make ends meet, kind of thing. The Republicans was started by people who were against slavery and people who wanted a very strong government that is going to help regulate the people, regulate our foreign policy, and protect us, kind of thing. Now, there are certain advantages of the two-party system. Throughout our history, since we've had a two-party system, both parties have had almost equal strength the entire way through. And so it allows us to have only two to choose from, so that kind of is a benefit. You don't have to look at multiple, like 20 different people. You choose between two for the most part. But it also means that these parties have to learn to work together. And so both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, have become what's known as a coalition. And a coalition is a large group of people that have learned to work together. Now, not all Republicans believe in the same thing, and not all Democrats believe in the same thing. And so that's what makes them a coalition, that they work together under the Democrats or the Republicans without actually all of them believing the exact same thing. So that makes them very unique as parties, but it also makes it an advantage because they're very open to accepting different people. Now, within the U.S., we do have third parties, and third parties are minor parties. They're ones that don't always get a lot of attention, and they don't always get a lot of votes. But these third parties have developed, and they take away votes from usually one of the major parties, of the two parties, and sometimes that can allow the other side to win. So they do have that. Typically, these third parties, none of them really ever win major offices like governors or president. But they make sure that the public hears every issue. So they're out there to basically make the public aware that, well, the Democrats aren't really taking a firm stand, or the Republicans are kind of wishy-washy on this issue. So they make sure that these parties are accountable, kind of thing. They also can propose laws, and some of these laws the major parties pick up. Like the Democrats will look at it and say, oh, that's a good idea, we should adopt that, and then they do. Or the Republicans are going to say, hey, this is a great idea, can we do something with it? So that's part of that as well. Now, there's many other party systems out there, and when you get to government your senior year, we'll be talking about some of those other systems. So just want to mention one kind, and that's the one-party governments. And typically one-party governments are dictatorships, because in a dictatorship there's no choice about who you're voting for. You're told this is what you're voting for. And there's no freedom. And so that's why most dictatorships are a one-party system. Now, not all one-party systems are dictatorships, but most dictatorships are one-party systems, if that makes sense. So anyway, but that's another system that's out there that so it's not just a two-party system. There are multi-party systems. There's one-party system. There's the two-party system. So the next thing we're going to look at is the political party organization. How are political parties organized? Well, they are organized at 3 levels, or 3 types of them, with the party committees. You have your national party committee, your state party committee, and your local party committee. So we're going to start with the national party committee, and the national is the largest party committee because it is for the whole nation. And it used to be that it was 1 man and 1 woman from every state, but they've kind of gotten away from that in recent years. But they still send 2 people from every state. So we have 100 people on the National Party Committee, and they choose a chairperson, somebody who heads it up. So it's kind of like the person in charge. And the chairperson is chosen by whoever the presidential candidate. And the committee selects the city where they're going to have the convention. And at the convention, that's where they choose their president and their vice presidential candidates. They set date and rules for the convention. The committee also raises money. They discuss policy. They try to recruit voters. So there's a lot of different things that they are doing. The state level of the party committees, each state has a Republican state committee, and they have a Democrat state committee. And the leader of their state committee is usually the man or woman who is on the national committee. And again, they are representing the party in each state, and they're trying to maintain the strength of the party by getting people registered as a Democrat or registered as a Republican. They try to raise money, and they're trying to help the state political offices to win their jobs. So like the governor and the state representative, state senator, that's who they're helping to try and win office. And then the third level is the local level, and there's 2 types. You can have a county level or a city level. It kind of depends on if you have a big city in your county. You might have 2, but like here in Plymouth County, we have a county level. We have a county Democratic county committee and a Republican county committee. But if you had a bigger city like Minneapolis or Chicago, you might have like a county for the city, or a county committee and a city committee in the same place. Anyway, what they do is they raise money for the party. They make recommendations about, oh, this person would be good to run for mayor, or this person would be really good on city council, or something along that line. And usually at your local party, it's organized that they divide the counties up into precincts in order to make the voting easier, so that not everybody's going to one location, which could create lines, and then you'd have a long waiting period and that kind of stuff. So they divide it up into precincts just to make the voting a little bit easier. But typically the local party helps to watch the elections, so they help to maintain the voting booths and all that kind of stuff. And they organize volunteers to help out the candidates in the county, so they're helping to distribute information. They make phone calls, they go door to door. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that they do. So within the United States, your right to vote is determined by the state. The state sets your qualifications, and those qualifications have to follow the Constitution. So a state can't set something outside of what the Constitution allows. So in the U.S., you have to be 18 because that was set by the 26th Amendment, and you basically in most states you have to register to vote. Most states require that you are a citizen, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to be. You can be disqualified from voting. Like states can say you cannot vote for certain reasons, and so we're going to look at a couple of those reasons. We're not going to go into all of them, but one of them is that maybe you have a serious mental illness, like you're unaware of what's happening. And so a lot of states have set like a minimum IQ level that you have to have before you are able to vote. And another reason you could be disqualified is if you committed a felony. Like you served jail time because you murdered somebody or you kidnapped or whatever, but you created some sort of felony. And if you are a convicted criminal, you forfeit your right to vote. You're not able to vote. So a lot of states disqualify you for that. Another thing would be if you have no established residence, that you are homeless, that you are a drifter or whatever. They disqualify you because in most states you have to prove your residency of the state to become a voter. So once you have that right to vote, once you are able to vote, there are several different elections that you are going to be able to participate in. And the first are primary elections. And like I said, there's two different types. There's the primary and the general. And we're going to look at the primaries. And the primaries are typically held in the spring. They usually start like January and they usually finish up around March. But they're typically held in the spring. And in primary elections, what you're doing is you're choosing candidates that you like, that you're saying, I'm voting for you because I like you better than the other Democrats, or I like you better than the other Republicans. So I vote for this person as a Republican because I like them better than the other Republicans. So it's basically a candidate preference election of who you would be willing to vote for. Now there's two different types of primary elections. There are closed primaries and open primaries. In a closed primary, only people who are registered with that particular political party can vote. And so that means if you are an independent, like you're not a registered Democrat or Republican, you can't vote in a closed primary. So you can't say, well, I like this person better than another. In an open primary, you can vote. Anybody can come in and vote. It doesn't matter. But most primary elections are closed primary elections, just because what could happen potentially is if it was an open primary for Democratic candidates, you could have a bunch of Republicans come in and vote for the worst candidate on the ticket, and then that would be who they preferred. And so, you know, they could kind of like work the system to get it so that you got a really crappy candidate running for the Democrats, and that would help the Republicans to win, kind of thing. I mean, so that's why they do a closed one. And there are two ways that you can win a primary. And it depends on the state. They make the determination of how it's going to be. But one can be through majority, and majority means 2/3, so like 60%. And the second way is just by having the highest number. So if you had 100 votes, let's go back. If you had 100 people voting, a majority vote would mean that you need 60 of those 100 votes. If you went by highest number, if it was a 51 to 49 vote, the 51 would win, even though it wasn't 60%, because it's not a majority, it's a highest number. So again, it depends on the state. They decide what kind of winning, which way you're going to be able to win. The second type of election is a general election, and it is the last election to determine the final winner. So the general election is the election that everybody hears about. It takes place on the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November. which is kind of an odd date, but there's a reason for it. The reason that they picked the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November. Let's think about this. Okay, so what's the last day of October? Last day of October is October 31st. That's Halloween. The following day is All Hallows Day, which, according to ancient tradition, is a day when spirits are still floating around the world, or floating on Earth. Like, spirits still have power. So again, like I said, it's an old superstition. It's an old belief, and so what the founding fathers, going in accordance with those old beliefs, they didn't want people making major decisions on days when there were spirits around that could influence you, and so they made it so that it will never fall on November 1st. It can only come on the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November. So we will never have an election on November 1st. It will always, the earliest it could be is November 2nd. So that's the whole history of why that happens. Anyway, so the presidential election, the general election for president, happens every 4 years. Congress has an election every 2 years, and that general election is the one that determines the final winner. So, nominating and electing our leaders. First, they start the campaign. The campaign is those who want to run start campaigning. And so they give speeches, they make appearances, they start, they basically throw their hat in the ring and say, yes, I'm interested in being president. Then they have the convention, and the convention delegates, each state is going to choose delegates from each party to go to the convention. And that's when they do that after the presidential primaries to figure out, okay, I'm going to vote for this guy. This is who I want to see to be the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. Then you have the National Nominating Convention, and that's held the summer before the presidential election. So if the presidential election's in November, they're going to hold their conventions in July and August prior to that. What happens at the convention is that the candidates are introduced, they debate on this person's better than this person, all that kind of stuff. Then they do a lot of mingling, and the chairperson calls for order. At that point, they present the party platform, and that's the policies and viewpoints of the party and where they're going to stand on the issues. And they vote and debate on the party platform. Then they begin to choose the presidential candidates, and they do a whole process. They start with nominating. Each state is called, so each state is called forward, and the delegate gives a nominating speech saying, I want this person to be nominated. Then after they do all that and they figure out, okay, who are all the contenders? Maybe it's 5 people, maybe it's just 1, maybe it's 2, whatever. But they have all of these people who have been nominated. Then they ballot, and balloting means that they're going to go around and vote. And they vote for whoever they want to be the presidential candidate. In order to win, you have to have majority vote. So majority means 60%. And so they roll call each state, and if they don't get a majority, then they go through the whole nominating process again. They start it all over again. And they do it over and over and over until they get a majority, until they get 60% of the votes. So once they have their presidential candidate, now they choose their vice presidential candidate. And it's usually somebody who is kind of popular, somebody who's going to help balance the ticket, and the presidential candidate helps to make that decision of who they think they can work with. Then they both give their acceptance speeches, and they usually are urging the party to unite behind them, and they give their positions on different topics, that this is what we want to fight for, this is what we're really thinking about. Then they begin their official election campaign. They go touring, and they try to make it to each state, because if you don't make it to each state, if you leave 2 states out, are those states going to vote for you? Probably not, because they want to get the attention too. And so they do a lot of commercials, they do a lot of debates in order to get their viewpoint out there, to get people to vote for them. And then we get to Election Day, which is the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November. And on Election Day, their campaign officially ends, and the media is then going to stay with the process and report the results from each state. So, when you are voting for president, when you guys become 18 and you finally are able to vote for president, you are not actually voting for the president. You're voting for an elector. And that's because we have this thing called the Electoral College. So, when you're voting for president, you're not voting for them directly. You're just casting your popular vote of who you want to vote for. You're voting for electors, and electors are people from each state. that vote with the way the state votes. And so the number depends on how many representatives and senators you have in your state. So like in Iowa, we have 4 representatives and we have 2 senators, which means we get 6 electoral votes. Other states are going to have different numbers depending on their population. So whichever candidate receives the majority of the electoral votes, that's who becomes the new president. Now, we have a total of 435 representatives plus our 100 senators. So that gives us 535. Plus, we get 3 more electoral votes that are extra from the District of Columbia. So in total, we have 538 electoral votes out there. And they need to get a majority. A majority is what? 60%. So 60% of 538 is 270 votes. So they need to have 270 plus electoral votes to win the election. And so that's why we keep watching the electoral votes as they're coming in. Which presidential candidate wins which state, because that number is going to help determine who wins the actual election. So that's how our whole election process works.